The massive chamber floated in space between 3 moons, and the light from distant stars painted everything in soft blue and silver tones that made the whole place feel cold and unwelcoming to any who entered without invitation or proper clearance. From the ruling powers that controlled this sector of the galaxy and decided the fate of lesser civilizations, Ambassador William stood alone at the center platform while hundreds of alien representatives watched him from their elevated positions around the circular room, and each one of them believed they already knew how this meeting would end because humans were weak and small and had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, while the older races had been crossing the stars. For thousands upon thousands of years, Commander Vila sat in her high seat, looking down at the human with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light, and her violet skin seemed to absorb the shadows around her while her long pointed ears twitched slightly as she listened to the preliminary reports from her advisors, who whispered that humanity controlled only 42 systems compared to the SCE. Thousands held by the combined forces of the council members. The elf woman had fought in 17 major campaigns and conquered worlds that resisted the natural order of galactic civilization, and she had never lost a single battle or failed to bring a rebellious species under proper control within the expected time frame, and her reputation alone was enough to make most civilizations surrender before the first shots were ever fired. Beside Vela sat Supreme Analyst Kira, whose massive brain could process information faster than most species could even perceive it, and her 6 compound eyes moved independently to track different data streams flowing across the holographic displays that surrounded her position in the council chamber, and she had already calculated 10,000 different scenarios for how humanity would fall. The gray-skinned alien woman clicked her mandibles together in a rhythm that her species used to indicate satisfaction with expected DTR outcomes, and her bioelectric patterns flickered across her flesh in complex sequences that other analysts in the chamber could read like written language, announcing that human defeat was mathematically certain. General Thera lounged in her suspension field with all 4 of her arms crossed over her armored carapace, and the insectoid woman had personally led ground forces on 93 planetary invasions and watched species after species break under the weight of superior firepower and tactical doctrine that had been refined over centuries of constant warfare. Her compound eyes reflected the image of Ambassador William in multiple facets, and she saw him from dozens of angles simultaneously, which allowed her to read every tiny movement and expression and body language signal that might betray fear or weakness or desperation, and so far the old human showed nothing but calm acceptance. High Chancellor Lissa coiled her serpentine lower body beneath her throne while her humanoid torso remained perfectly still, and the golden-scaled woman had ruled the Serpentis Empire for 3 full centuries and outlived entire generations of conquered species who learned to serve their masters with appropriate humility and gratitude. The alien woman had personally negotiated the surrender of 47 different civilizations, and she knew exactly how to break the spirit of resistance by offering just enough mercy to prevent total extinction while taking enough freedom to ensure permanent submission to the natural hierarchy of galactic power. Admiral Zora existed partially in regular space and partially in dimensions that most species could not even perceive. In her crystalline body refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and she had witnessed the birth and death of stars and considered herself beyond the petty concerns of flesh-bound creatures who could only exist in 3 dimensions. The alien woman projected her consciousness across multiple quantum states simultaneously, which allowed her to experience time in non-linear fashion, and she had already seen probable futures where humanity ceased to exist as an independent civilization and became just another servitor species. Mining resources for their betters, Ambassador William activated his datapad, and the holographic projectors around the chamber came to life, showing maps of human-controlled space and the pathetic defensive installations that protected their worlds from invasion. And the assembled council members studied the displays with growing amusement. Commander Vila spoke first, and her melodic voice carried across the chamber with perfect clarity, enhanced by the translation systems built into every surface, and she asked William, Why humanity thought they deserved to maintain independence, when clearly they lacked the strength to defend their territorial claims. The elder human looked up at the elf woman, and his weathered face showed no emotion as he began to explain that humanity had only recently joined the galactic community and needed time to develop proper exploit defensive capabilities and trade relationships with neighboring civilizations. Analyst Kira interrupted with clicking sounds that translated to harsh criticism of human technological development, and she displayed her calculations showing that humanity would need at least 2,000 years to reach military parity with even the weakest council members, and by that time their territory would already be absorbed in Aerothera. Added her assessment that human ground forces showed poor tactical awareness during recent border skirmishes, and their soldiers relied too heavily on individual initiative rather than following proper command structures that maximized unit effectiveness in combat situations. High Chancellor Lisa suggested that humanity should accept protectorate status under Serpentis control, which would allow them to maintain limited self-governance in exchange for resource extraction rights and mandatory military service in council peacekeeping operations throughout the outer territories. Admiral Zora projected probability matrices showing that human resistance would collapse within 6 months of sustained military pressure, and reconstruction under council oversight would take approximately 15 years before human worlds became productive members of galactic civilization. Ambassador William listened to each speaker without interrupting, and his hands remained steady as he took notes on his datapad and occasionally glanced at the displays showing human space surrounded by hostile forces that could crush his civilization whenever they chose to act. The old human cleared his throat and requested permission to respond to the proposals that had been presented, and Commander Vela granted him 5 minutes to make his case before the council would vote on how to proceed with humanity. William began speaking in slow, measured tones that seemed almost casual compared to the formal diplomatic language used by the alien representatives, and he thanked the council for their time and consideration of humanity during this difficult period of galactic transition. He explained that humans understood their position as newcomers to interstellar civilization and recognized that older species possessed superior technology and greater numbers and longer histories of successful expansion across the stars. The ambassador acknowledged that human defensive capabilities were indeed limited, and that their fleet could not hope to match the combined forces of even a single council member in direct combat under conventional engagement rules. Commander Vila leaned forward slightly, and her glowing eyes narrowed as she studied the human more carefully, because his words sounded like the beginning of surrender, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. William continued by noting that the council had conquered many species throughout galactic history and incorporated them into the existing power structure, with varying degrees of success, depending on how quickly the conquered populations adapted to their new circumstances. Supreme Analyst Kira made notes on her displays, and her compound eyes tracked the human with increased attention as her calculations began producing unexpected variables that did not fit the standard models for species capitulation. The elder human then said something that made every representative in the chamber pause and reconsider their assumptions about this meeting and the outcome they had expected. William spoke quietly, but his words carried weight that made the council members shift uncomfortably in their seats, and he said that the gathered representatives had made a fundamental error in their calculations about humanity, because they assumed humans would react like every other species they had conquered. Commander Vela uncrossed her arms and sat up straighter in her elevated chair, and the elf woman felt something she had not experienced in decades of military service, which was genuine uncertainty about the outcome of a conflict before it even began. The ambassador explained that human history was different from the histories of other galactic civilizations in ways that made direct comparison impossible and meaningful analysis difficult. For those who had never experienced the particular kind of warfare that humans practiced on their
Activated.
homeworld, he activated new displays showing images from Earth, and the holographic projections filled the chamber with scenes of human cities burning and armies clashing in populations, suffering under occupation, and yet somehow rebuilding and fighting again generation after generation. Supreme Analyst Kira studied the data flowing across her screens, and her calculations began producing results that contradicted her earlier predictions, and she made adjustments to her models, trying to account for variables she had not previously considered important. William showed the council images of human conflicts that lasted not years but decades, and sometimes centuries, and he explained that humans had fought themselves in wars that killed millions and destroyed entire regions, and yet the survivors always regrouped and continued fighting. General Thara watched the displays with growing interest, and her compound eyes tracked the tactical patterns in human warfare, and she noticed something disturbing about how human forces operated without regard for standard doctrine or acceptable casualty ratios. The insectoid woman had conquered species that fought fiercely to defend their homes, but they all eventually recognized when defeat became inevitable, and they all eventually accepted terms that allowed them to survive under new management. The images William showed depicted something different entirely, and they showed humans fighting long after defeat should have been obvious, and continuing resistance even when victory seemed mathematically impossible. High Chancellor Lissa studied one particular image that showed human rebels hiding in ruins of their own cities and conducting guerrilla operations against occupation forces that controlled all strategic resources, and she felt her coils tighten involuntarily. The Serpent Woman had overseen countless occupations, and she knew how to break resistance by controlling food and water and medical supplies until the surviving population learned to cooperate with their conquerors in exchange for basic necessities. But the humans in the images did not seem to care about such practical concerns, and they fought on even when fighting meant starvation and death and the complete destruction of everything they claimed to be protecting. Admiral Zora expanded her consciousness across multiple probability streams, trying to find futures where human resistance followed predictable patterns. But every simulation produced chaos and unpredictable outcomes that violated standard models. The crystalline woman existed partially outside normal time, and she could perceive probable outcomes before they manifested in regular space. But somehow human behavior created quantum uncertainty that cascaded across multiple timelines. William continued his presentation, and he showed the council examples of human tactics that made no logical sense from a strategic perspective, but proved devastatingly effective in practice. Displayed images of human soldiers fighting in conditions that should have broken morale, and continuing operations long after supply lines were cut and reinforcements became impossible. The ambassador explained that humans had evolved on a death world where nearly everything could kill them, and they survived by becoming more stubborn and more adaptable and more willing to pay terrible costs than any threat they faced. Commander Vila interrupted. "I hasn't asked what this history lesson had to do with the current situation," and William looked directly at her with eyes that held no fear. "Only absolute certainty." The old human said that the council was about to make the same mistake that every human empire and kingdom and nation made throughout history, which was assuming that defeating human forces meant ending human resistance. Explained that humans did not separate military defeat from the possibility of future victory, and they did not accept that losing battles meant losing wars, and they never believed that occupation by superior forces meant permanent subjugations. Analyst Kira began running new calculations based on the historical data William provided, and her compound eyes moved faster as probability matrices filled her displays with outcomes she had not previously considered. General Thera demanded to know if the ambassador was threatening the council with guerrilla warfare, and William shook his head slowly. He said he was not threatening anything, only explaining what would happen if the council chose to invade. High Chancellor Lissa leaned forward, and her golden eyes fixed on the human, and she asked how long he thought human resistance could survive against the combined military might of civilizations that had conquered thousands of worlds. William smiled, and the expression held no humor, only grim acknowledgement of truth, and he said that the question was not how long humanity could resist, but how much the council was willing to lose in the process of subjugation. The ambassador explained that humans would not fight a conventional war because they could not win such a conflict, and instead they would adopt tactics that maximized council casualties while minimizing the need for direct confrontation. showed tactical analyses of human guerrilla campaigns throughout history, and pointed out that occupying forces always possessed superior firepower, and better technology, and more resources. But somehow the resistance always survived long enough to become too expensive to continue fighting. Admiral Zora projected her consciousness across multiple dimensions, trying to calculate the economic cost of prolonged human resistance, and every simulation showed resource drains that increased exponentially over time. Commander Vela stood from her seat, and her violet skin flushed darker with anger, and she declared that the Council would not be intimidated by threats from a species that could barely defend itself. Pirates William remained calm and said that he was not trying to intimidate anyone, only fulfill his final duty as an ambassador, which was to ensure that all parties understood the consequences of their decisions before those decisions became irreversible. He explained that after this meeting he would return to Earth and resign his position, and humanity would send no more diplomats because there would be nothing left to negotiate. Supreme Analyst Kira felt her bioelectric patterns shift into configurations associated with alarm as she realized the implications of what the human was saying, and she began calculating how quickly the situation could deteriorate into open conflict. General Thera demanded to know if humanity was declaring war, and William shook his head and said that humans never declared war. They simply responded to threats against their survival with every tool and tactic and strategy available. High Chancellor Lissa tried to regain control of the meeting, and she offered humanity one final chance to accept protectorate status with generous terms that would preserve limited autonomy and prevent the need for military action. The ambassador thanked her for the offer and declined on behalf of all humanity, and he said that humans would rather die fighting than live as subjects of foreign powers, no matter how benevolent those powers claimed to be. Admiral Zora attempted one last calculation, trying to find a future where both sides avoided catastrophic conflict, but the quantum uncertainty created by human unpredictability made accurate prediction impossible. Commander Vila called for an immediate vote among council members, and she recommended that they proceed with military action against human space before humanity could prepare more extensive defensive measures or develop weapons that might complicate the invasion. The elf woman had fought too many campaigns to ignore warning signs, and something about Ambassador William troubled her deeply, but she pushed those concerns aside because doubt was weakness, and weakness led to defeat. Supreme Analyst Kira began distributing her final calculations to all council members, and the data showed overwhelming probability of quick victory of forces mobilized within the next standard month before humans could adapt their tactics. General Thera supported immediate action, and she volunteered to lead the ground invasion personally once orbital defenses fell, and she estimated that human resistance would collapse within 6 months of sustained pressure. High Chancellor Lissa counseled caution and suggested that perhaps the Council should consider alternative approaches before committing to full-scale war, but her voice was drowned out by other representatives eager to expand their territories. Admiral Zora remained silent, and her crystalline form flickered between dimensions as she calculated outcomes across multiple probability streams, and every future she examined showed violence and suffering far beyond normal conquest scenarios. The vote proceeded rapidly, with representatives from dozens of civilizations raising their approval for military intervention, and only a handful abstained, while none voted against the motion to invade. Human Space Ambassador William watched the voting process without expression, and his weathered face showed no surprise or disappointment, only quiet acceptance of what was about to unfold. Commander Vela announced that the motion passed with overwhelming support, and military operations would begin within 30 standard days to allow proper fleet coordination and supply line establishment. The elf woman looked directly at William and told him that he had 24 hours to leave Council space before being detained as an enemy combatant, and she advised him to use that time wisely. The old human nodded slowly and gathered his datapad and deactivated the holographic displays around his platform, and he turned to face the assembled Council. One final time William spoke quietly, but every word carried across the chamber, and he said that he hoped history would remember this moment and judge fairly whether the Council had chosen wisdom or pride. He explained that humanity would not forget this decision and would not forgive those who voted to destroy human independence in future generations. Both sides would pay the price for what happened here. Today's Supreme Analyst Kira tried to interrupt, but William continued speaking and said that he had served as a diplomat for 7 decades across hostile stars and learned many things about war and peace and the cost of both. The ambassador said that the saddest lesson was that civilizations rarely learn from history and always believed their situation was different and their enemies were weaker than past foes who had been defeated. General Thera laughed and her mandibles clicked in amusement, and she said that human philosophy would not save them from superior firepower and better trained forces. William agreed that philosophy would not save humanity, but neither would it need saving, because humans specialized in survival under impossible conditions and thrived when backed into corners. High Chancellor Lissa tried once more to offer compromise, and she suggested that perhaps humanity would reconsider their position after seeing preliminary military operations. Demonstrate council superiority. The old human shook his head and said that demonstrations of power only worked on species that valued survival over freedom, and humans had proven throughout their history that they valued freedom more than life. Itself Admiral Zora finally spoke, and her harmonic voice carried sadness unusual for her species, and she said that she saw terrible futures branching from this decision, and hoped that somehow both civilizations would find wisdom before it was too late. Commander Vela dismissed such concerns and reminded the Council that they had conquered countless civilizations and humanity would be no different regardless of their proud words and defiant speeches. William thanked the Council for their time and began walking toward the exit portal that would transport him back to his ship, and he moved slowly like someone carrying great weight on aging shoulders. As he reached the doorway, he paused and turned back one final time, and the assembled representatives fell silent, waiting to hear if he had any last words before war began. The ambassador said that he wanted them to remember something important about humans and their history and their nature, that all the analysis and calculations had missed. He explained that humans had spent 10,000 years fighting themselves in wars that should have destroyed their species, and yet somehow they survived and grew stronger and spread across their entire planet. William said that humans had mastered every environment on Earth, from frozen tundra to scorching deserts, and learned to thrive in conditions that killed other species. Old Human noted that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and natural disasters that wiped out most other life forms, and they did this without claws or fangs or armored scales. Said that humans climbed to the top of their food chain not through superior strength, but through stubbornness and adaptability and willingness to keep trying. Long after failure should have stopped them, Ambassador William looked at Commander Vela and Supreme Analyst Kira and General Thera and High Chancellor Lissa and Admiral Zora, and he spoke words that would echo through galactic history. He said that the Council was about to learn what happened when you threatened a species that evolved by refusing to accept limits and refusing to quit and refusing to acknowledge that anything was impossible. The human explained that every predator on Earth learned eventually to avoid humans, because even when humans lost individual encounters, they never stopped coming back, and they never stopped adapting, and they never stopped finding new ways to win. Williams said that the Council possessed better technology and more ships in superior numbers, but those advantages only mattered if the war followed rules that humans had never learned to respect. He warned that humans would steal Council technology and adapt Council weapons and learn Council tactics faster than anyone expected, because that was what humans did when faced with existential threats. The ambassador said that occupation forces would face enemies who looked like civilians and fought like soldiers and disappeared into populations that all looked the same to alien observers. He explained that human resistance would target supply lines and communication networks and isolated outposts, and any vulnerability they could find or create through patience and observation. William noted that humans had practiced guerrilla warfare for thousands of years against empires that controlled vast territories and possessed overwhelming military superiority, and somehow the guerrillas usually won. Eventually, he said that Council forces would win every major battle and control every strategic location and still lose. The war because humans did not measure victory by territory controlled, but by will to continue fighting. The old humans said that human children would grow up hating the council and learning from parents who remembered freedom and passing that hatred to their own children across generations, if necessary. Ambassador William told the assembled representatives that they could kill billions of humans and bomb human cities to rubble and occupy human worlds for centuries, and it would not matter, he explained that somewhere. In the ruins, survivors would be hiding and planning and building weapons from scraps and teaching new fighters how to strike back against occupiers. The humans said that the cost would grow with every passing year as council species began questioning
why their soldiers kept dying for territories that generated no
profit and provided no benefit. William predicted that eventually some council member would break ranks and offer support to human resistance fighters in exchange for future trade agreements or territorial concessions. Said that other council members would follow and the alliance would fracture and human resistance would exploit every crack and weakness until the occupation became unsustainable. The ambassador finished by saying that this was not a threat or a bluff, only a description of what would happen based on 10,000 years of human experience fighting. Wars exactly like this one. Then William turned and walked through the portal and disappeared from the council chamber. Leaving silence behind him, Commander Vila stood in the command center of her flagship 30 days after the council meeting and watched as her fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of human-controlled space near a colony world called New Boston. The elf woman commanded 17 battle groups totaling 300 warships and supporting vessels, and she had orders to demonstrate council's superiority by capturing the colony with minimal casualties on both sides. Her tactical displays showed New Boston. It's a farming world with limited defensive installations and a population of approximately 2 million humans who should surrender once they understood the futility of resistance. Prime analyst Kira monitored the operation from her command ship, and her compound eyes tracked thousands of data streams simultaneously as she analyzed human responses to the council fleet appearance. The gray-skinned alien woman had predicted that human defenders would attempt conventional engagement and lose quickly, and then civilian leadership would negotiate surrender to prevent unnecessary casualties. General Thera waited in her assault transport with 40,000 ground troops ready to deploy once orbital defenses fell, and she expected light resistance from poorly trained human militia, for the insectoid woman had studied the tactical data William provided during his presentation and concluded that human guerrilla tactics required time to organize and would not factor into the initial invasion phase. Admiral Zora observed from multiple dimensional perspectives, and she saw probability streams converging toward outcomes that matched neither Kira's predictions nor William's warnings, and the uncertainty troubled her deeply. Commander Vila opened communications channels and broadcast surrender demands to New Boston authorities, and she offered generous terms, including continued local governance in exchange for accepting council oversight. Human response came within minutes, and a woman identifying herself as Governor Rebecca Miller appeared on the screen, and her face showed no fear, only calm determination. Governor Miller thanked Commander Vila for the offer and declined on behalf of all New Boston citizens, and she said that humans would rather die free than live as subjects. Regardless of how reasonable the terms appeared, the elf woman felt anger rising but suppressed it and explained that resistance was pointless and would only result in needless deaths and destruction of infrastructure that could be preserved through cooperation. Rebecca Miller agreed that resistance seemed pointless from a military perspective, but said that humans measured worth by different standards than the council apparently used. The HL Governor explained that New Boston colonists had left Earth specifically to build independent lives away from centralized authority, and they would not surrender that independence willingly. Commander Vila terminated communications and ordered her fleet to begin bombardment of military targets, and she kept the attacks precise to minimize civilian casualties. While demonstrating overwhelming firepower, the orbital defense platforms around New Boston fired back and managed to destroy 2 council frigates before being obliterated by massed weapons fire from Vila's battle groups. Supreme Analyst Kira noted with satisfaction that human defenses performed exactly as predicted, and the colony would fall within 6 hours, according to updated calculations. General Thera launched her assault transports toward the planet's surface, and her troops encountered light resistance from human fighters using outdated weapons and predictable tactics. Insectoid Woman watched her forces secure landing zones and advance toward major population centers, and everything proceeded according to plan with acceptable casualties on both sides. Then something changed, and the organized human resistance seemed to dissolve and disappear, and General Thera's troops found themselves occupying empty cities where civilians had vanished overnight. Supreme Analyst Kira expanded her sensor networks trying to locate the missing population, and her displays showed heat signatures scattered across vast wilderness areas surrounding the colony settlements. Commander Vila ordered pursuit operations, but her ground forces reported difficulty tracking humans through dense forests and rough terrain that vehicles could not easily navigate. Thera led reconnaissance teams into the wilderness and discovered that humans had prepared extensive tunnel networks and hidden supply caches. Long before the invasion began, the Insectoid Woman realized with growing concern that New Boston colonists had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario, despite all diplomatic efforts suggesting they hoped to avoid conflict. Admiral Zora watched probability streams shift as human tactics evolved beyond conventional warfare, and she tried to warn the other commanders, but her harmonic transmissions arrived to light the first Council patrol disappeared in the forest, and search teams found only wreckage and no bodies and no clear indication of what weapons the humans used. More patrols vanished. General Thara reinforced her perimeter defenses, but the attacks continued from unexpected angles, using hit-and-run tactics that avoided direct confrontation. Commander Vila deployed aerial drones to track human movements, but the colonists had learned to mask their heat signatures and move in patterns that confused automated targeting systems. Supreme Analyst Kira ran continuous analysis, trying to predict where humans would strike next. But every model produced different results, and the uncertainty grew with each passing day. Governor Rebecca Miller broadcast messages from hidden locations, and she explained to Council forces that New Boston would never surrender and resistance would continue until the occupiers left or were destroyed. Human Woman said that colonists understood they could not win conventional battles, but they could make occupations so costly that eventually the Council would decide New Boston was not worth keeping. General Thera tried aggressive sweeps through suspected resistance zones, but her troops found only empty camps and abandoned equipment, and occasionally triggered traps that caused casualties. The Insectoid Woman requested additional forces, but Commander Vela hesitated because deploying more troops would mean drawing resources from other invasion targets. Supreme Analyst Kira calculated that pacifying New Boston would require at least 2 years of sustained operations and 3 times the initially allocated forces. Admiral Zora examined futures where Council forces remained on New Boston, and every timeline showed casualties mounting and morale declining and political pressure building to withdraw. Commander Vela made the difficult decision to maintain occupation with current force levels and accept that complete pacification might take longer than originally estimated. The Elf Woman reported to the Council that New Boston had fallen and orbital space was secured, but ground operations faced unexpected complications that required additional time. High Chancellor Lissa reviewed the reports and noted with concern one small farming colony was consuming resources that should have been used to invade multiple human systems. She called a council meeting to discuss whether operations should continue as planned, or if strategy needed adjustment based on early results from New Boston. The assembled representatives studied casualty reports and resource expenditures, and some began questioning whether Ambassador William had been correct about human resistance capabilities. Commander Vela assured the Council that New Boston represented an anomaly, and other human colonies would fall more easily once proper tactics were developed for dealing with guerrilla warfare. General Thera agreed and said that her forces were learning from each engagement and developing countermeasures that would reduce effectiveness of human hit-and-run tactics. Supreme Analyst Kira presented calculations showing that resistance would eventually collapse once humans exhausted their prepared supplies and realized that relief would not come from Earth. Admiral Zora said nothing because she could see futures where New Boston remained contested for decades and similar situations developed. On every human world the Council invaded, the Council voted to continue operations and authorize invasion of 3 more human colonies to maintain momentum and prevent humanity from consolidating defenses. Commander Vela selected targets carefully, choosing worlds with smaller populations and less developed infrastructure that should fall more quickly than New Boston. Her fleet divided into multiple battle groups and prepared to assault the new targets simultaneously to stretch human defensive capabilities across multiple systems. General Thera trained specialized units in counterinsurgency tactics and equipped them with sensors designed to detect human heat signatures and movement patterns through various terrain types. Supreme Analysts Kira developed prediction algorithms based on New Boston resistance patterns and distributed them to all Council military units preparing for deployment against human worlds. Admiral Zora withdrew from active command duties and spent her time calculating probability streams, trying to find futures where both civilizations survived the coming years intact. Back on New Boston, Governor Rebecca Miller met with resistance cell leaders in underground bunkers, and they reviewed their success in frustrating Council occupation for the human woman explained that their goal was not to win but to survive and make occupation too expensive, and eventually the Council would lose interest or face rebellion from their own populations tired of endless war. She said that reports from Earth indicated similar resistance developing on other invaded worlds, and human forces were sharing tactics and lessons learned across systems. Despite Council control of orbital space, Rebecca Miller told her people that the fight would last years or decades or generations if necessary, but humans would outlast their enemies because humans always did. Eventually 3 years passed since the Council invasion began, and Commander Vela sat in her command center reviewing casualty reports that showed numbers far exceeding original projections for the entire campaign. The elf woman had conquered 12 human colonies, but each one required months of fighting and ongoing occupation forces that drained resources from other Council operations across the galaxy. Her tactical officers reported that human resistance showed no signs of weakening, and new fighters kept appearing to replace casualties, and tactics continued evolving faster than Council countermeasures could adapt. Supreme Analyst Kira no longer provided confident predictions because human behavior violated every model she created, and probability calculations produced uncertainty ranges too wide for effective strategic planning. The gray-skinned alien woman had requested assistance from other Council analysts, but none could develop reliable methods for predicting when or where humans would strike. Next, General Thera commanded occupation forces on 7 worlds simultaneously, and every planet presented unique challenges that required different approaches and constant adjustment to changing resistance tactics. The insectoid woman had lost 3,000 troops in the past year, and recruitment offices struggled to find replacements willing to deploy against enemies who never fought fair and never accepted defeat. Admiral Zora spent most of her time reviewing futures where the war continued indefinitely, and both civilizations exhausted themselves fighting over territories that generated no strategic value. High Chancellor Lissa called emergency council meetings every month to address growing concerns from member civilizations questioning why their resources funded wars against primitives who should have surrendered years ago. Serpent Woman had personally negotiated with captured human resistance fighters, offering pardons and reconstruction aid in exchange for cooperation. But every prisoner refused and chose execution instead. Commander Vela studied reports from intelligence operatives who had infiltrated human civilian populations and learned that even non-combatants supported resistance through supply networks and information sharing. Elf Woman discovered that human children as young as 8 participated in resistance operations by carrying messages and hiding weapons and watching for Council patrol patterns. She ordered her troops to avoid harming civilians when possible, but distinguishing fighters from non-combatants became impossible when entire populations contributed to resistance efforts. Supreme Analyst Kira analyzed captured human communications and found that resistance cells operated independently with minimal coordination yet. Somehow their tactics remained consistent across different worlds. The alien woman realized that humans possessed cultural knowledge. It's about guerrilla warfare that required no formal training or command structure and passed naturally through there.
A civilian
Population General Thera attempted to isolate human settlements from wilderness areas where resistance forces hid, but construction of security barriers consumed resources faster than council engineers could deploy materials. The insectoid woman watched her carefully planned defensive positions get compromised repeatedly by humans who tunneled underneath or climbed over or simply found weak points that surveillance systems missed. Admiral Zora examined probability streams, showing council member civilizations growing restless as their citizens demanded answers about why the war continued and when troops would return home. On Earth, the human government prepared defensive measures while supporting resistance on occupied worlds through covert supply drops and intelligence sharing that council forces could not prevent. Ambassador William had retired after the war began, but occasionally provided analysis to military planners about council tactics and how human forces might exploit weaknesses in alien command structures. The old man had warned that the war would last decades and cost both sides terribly in watching. His predictions come true brought him no satisfaction, only deep sadness. Commander Vila received reports that 3 council-member civilizations had withdrawn their forces from the invasion, fleet citing unsustainable casualties and lack of progress. Towards stated objectives, the elf woman tried to maintain morale among remaining troops, but soldiers questioned why they risked their lives occupying worlds that cost more to control than they generated in resources. High Chancellor Lissa faced rebellion in her own empire as conquered species, saw how effectively humans resisted, and began organizing their own independence movements. The Serpent Woman realized too late that the Council had made a strategic error by demonstrating that resistance could succeed against overwhelming force if populations remained committed. Supreme Analyst Kira presented calculations showing that continuing the war would require doubling current force commitments and accepting that complete pacification might never occur. General Thera reported that human tactics had evolved to include captured council technology and resistance fighters now used alien weapons and vehicles against occupation forces. The insectoid woman discovered that humans learned quickly from every engagement and adapted faster than council forces could adjust their procedures and training protocols. Admiral Zora finally spoke at a council meeting and said that she had examined 10,000 probable futures and found none where the council achieved victory without suffering damage that might destroy the alliance itself. Commander Vela argued that withdrawing would embolden other species to resist council authority and show weakness that could not be tolerated in a galaxy where strength determined legitimacy. High Chancellor Lissa countered that continuing the war created exactly the instability that Vila feared, and that strategic withdrawal might preserve council credibility better than endless grinding conflict. Debate continued for hours as representatives argued about honor and practical concerns, and whether admitting mistake was worse than perpetuating failed. Strategist Supreme Analyst Kira presented final analysis showing that human resistance would continue for at least another decade, even under best-case scenarios for council military operations. General Thara added that her forces could maintain current occupation levels, but lacked strength to expand operations or crush resistance completely. Without massive reinforcement, Admiral Zora described futures where the Council fractured over disagreements about the war, and member civilizations began competing for power rather than cooperating toward shared goals. The vote came finally, and by narrow margin the Council decided to open negotiations with Earth government about terms for ending hostilities and withdrawing from occupied worlds. Commander Vila abstained from voting because she could not support withdrawal, but understood that continuing was no longer feasible given political realities. The elf woman had spent 3 years fighting humans and learned that Ambassador William had been absolutely correct about everything he warned during that final meeting. High Chancellor Lissa contacted Earth through diplomatic channels and requested talks about peace terms, and was surprised when human government agreed immediately to begin negotiations. Serpent Woman expected humans to demand reparations and apologies, but instead, they asked only for complete withdrawal from all occupied territories and recognition of Human Sovereignty Council. Representatives questioned why humans did not press their advantage and demand more concessions, when clearly the Council was desperate to end the costly war. The human negotiator explained that humanity sought only independence, not revenge, and that both civilizations would benefit from peaceful coexistence rather than perpetual conflicts. Prim. Analyst Kira studied the human position and realized they understood that the Council could return in future with greater preparation and that permanent peace required finding terms. Both sides could accept. General Thera oversaw the withdrawal of occupation forces from human worlds and watched as resistance fighters emerged from hiding to celebrate liberation they had earned through years of sacrifice. Insectoid Woman felt respect for enemies who had fought so effectively despite inferior technology, and wondered if the Council had learned anything from this humiliating experience. Admiral Zora examined new probability streams and saw futures where humans and Council civilizations traded peacefully and even allied against external threats from unexplored regions of the galaxy. Commander Vila returned to Council space and resigned her commission. She could no longer serve an organization that had made such catastrophic errors in judgment. The elf woman spent her remaining years writing analysis of the war and warning future generations about the dangers of underestimating opponents based on technological disparities alone. New Boston Governor Rebecca Miller stood with other survivors and watched Council ships depart orbital space and felt exhausted relief that their long nightmare had finally ended. The human woman knew that reconstruction would take years, and that many would never recover from trauma of occupation, but they had preserved their freedom, and that mattered. Most Ambassador William lived long enough to see peace restored and died quietly, knowing that his final warning had been proven tragically accurate by events that followed. Humanity emerged from the war transformed and hardened and determined never again to rely solely on diplomacy when dealing with civilizations that measured worth by strength alone. The Council retreated behind their borders and began a long process of examining what went wrong and how they could avoid similar disasters in future encounters with unknown species. And across the galaxy, other civilizations watched and learned that humans were different, and that attempting to conquer them would cost far more than any potential gain could justify. The war ended, but its lessons echoed through galactic civilization for centuries, reminding everyone that technological superiority guaranteed nothing when facing opponents who simply refused to quit.